are going to refer back to the last lesson for a few minutes today, the start of this lesson. I closed with a brief talk on the Black Death, the bubonic plague. And I want to refer to that again because the consequences of the Black Death were immediate, far-reaching, and long-lasting. We are going through a little COVID pandemic today in America, and we hear daily about the death counts and the consequences, and we see it for ourselves with the bare shelves and the problems of transportation and shipping and so forth, the problems that a pandemic can create or is created for us by government. But anyway, this that we're going through today in America is nothing compared to the earth-shattering consequences of the Black Death in 1347, 48, and 49. Actually, it lasted a long time. They had periodic outbreaks of the Black Death until the 1750s. Matter of fact, they still have it occasionally. Many years ago, I had a next-door neighbor that was a veterinarian that went out rabbit hunting, and he came back with a rabbit down from the river bottoms, and he skinned it in preparation to eating it, and while he was skinning it, he nicked his hand with a sharp knife, and 2 or 3 days later, he thought he had a flu or the cold or something, and he got sick and sicker and sicker, and by the time they got him to the hospital, he died, and he died of the Black Death. He died of bubonic plague. So a neighbor of mine in this generation, but it is exceedingly rare. And one of the medical questions asked is, why don't we have it today? The answer is that we evidently, as human beings, have built up an immunity, us survivors have built up an immunity to the Black Death, and people can still get it, but its consequences are nothing like it was in 1347, 1348, and 1349. As I said last week or last lesson, the effects of that was devastating. I read just today where a man and his wife buried their 5 children. All 5 of the kids got it, and all 5 died. And the effects on the world, the European world that we're talking about, the church world, was almost impossible to overemphasize. First of all, the economic impact of the Black Death was draconian. This was the end of the feudal system in Europe. The feudal system could not survive the consequences of the Black Death. Maybe it didn't need to, but it didn't because of the death of so many workers. When health was restored, when men tried to start picking up the pieces of their lives and start businesses again, the workers had a tremendous advantage that they did not enjoy before the Black Death, and they could command higher wages, work where they wanted to, and nobody could turn them down because there was a dearth of workers. Again, there is a similarity to what we're going through now. If you don't have a job in America today, you're not looking. You don't want a job because there are businesses begging for workers, and for one reason or another, there is a shortage of people that are willing to work. And so, but the Black Death, again, was 1,000 times worse than anything we're experiencing in America. There was also political consequences to this dirge on the world. It just, things changed dramatically, even in the political world. There were still kings and kingdoms, but everybody had a different outlook on life than they did before the Black Death came. But the greatest impact that I want to dwell on today was the religious consequences of the Black Death. I touched on it again last lesson, but I want to go into in depth in this because the problems that evolved from the Black Death were long-lasting. It actually lasted almost 200 years and did not end until the Protestant Reformation. And that sounds impossible, but it was very possible. First of all, you have to understand how the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church was in those days and still is today. and that is that church leaders are appointed by councils and leaders from above, and it's almost impossible to not favor your friends or people that you like or people whose views you agree with, to give them high office or elect them to high office. And so the Catholic Church has had a self-appointing hierarchy for 1,000 years. And when the people doing the appointing are religious and conscientious and want the best for the church, this was great. But if you get a certain group of people into the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, it takes hundreds of years to get rid of not just them, but their influence. They may die, but the people they appointed to office live on, and then the people they appointed to office lives on. So it takes hundreds of years to purge a system like the Roman Catholic Church from the problems that evolved from the Black Death. And we know what those problems were. Men were appointed that were not qualified. They didn't have any choice. All the priests had died. As I said last time, the mortality rate among the priesthood was over 90%. The mortality rate on the nuns was over 90%. The people that stayed and tried to help the sick died almost completely. Even the monasteries, because of the closeness of the communion and the closeness of the fellowship, they all lived together and slept together and ate together. If sickness came to the monasteries, then almost everybody died. And so the monastic system pretty well died out at the Black Death. Now, they still had monasteries, of course, but not nearly as important or as sought after as was before the Black Death. The monastic system is kind of a strange system in which men would leave the world. They would leave the life of a husband and a father and a worker and a citizen and go into a monastery and close out the whole world. And they lived in those monasteries with their little chores and their little hours of prayer and no responsibilities. Nothing was asked of them but just to abide by their little habitual working habits and prayer habits. And so the world passed them by, and that's the way they wanted it. And it was a very important part of the thinking of Europe, because men saw this as an escape. Women that had problems with husbands or fathers or life would go into an abbess and become a nun, and they would escape the world. And there are people that think that sounds pretty good today. A lot of people dream of going to a desert island out in the Southwest Pacific and living there alone. Now, most of us never do it and wouldn't if we had a chance, but it's kind of a dream. It's kind of an illusion that we all kind of harbor, and in those days it became very real. They had monasteries to go to where they could escape from life. And that lasted until the Black Death. And afterwards there were still some, but nothing with the impetus that you saw before the Black Death. There were hundreds of monasteries populated by tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women that had left life as we know it. They were not a productive part of society. They had no children. They had no jobs. They founded no industries. They went and shut the doors to the monastery and lived there till they died. And so that's was a way of life that ended basically with the Black Death. So there was a lot of religious consequences to this, and one of the great one was, as I've said, men that were unqualified to be leaders in the Catholic Church were appointed into positions of leadership. And again, this was a self-perpetuating system. If you got carnal men in leadership, if you appointed carnal men to be priests and bishops, in time they became cardinals and even popes, and they perpetuated that carnality. They perpetuated that worldly mindset that was not present before the Black Death, not nearly as much anyway. There's always been people that were not religious that had religious offices, but with the Black Death it became universal. And it took 200 years to purge the Catholic Church from this dearth. And we don't have to go into ancient history to see this. I remember back in the 50s reading religious articles having to do with the Roman Catholic Church, and that there was a shortage of priests. There were not enough men entering the seminaries and the colleges to provide for priests for all the offices that were available. And so there were churches that had no priests and offices that were not filled because there just weren't the men. And so to fill this gap in numbers, the Roman Catholic Church lowered their standards of what it took to be a priest. And not only scholastically, but even morally. And so a large group of homosexual priests were appointed into the priesthood. Now, there's always been homosexual priests. It's a lifestyle that attracts homosexuality, but nothing like the numbers that came into the priesthood in the 50s. Soon there was enough people in the seminaries to provide for enough priests, but you had a whole generation there, a whole gap of priests that had a predominant, disproportionate number of homosexuals in it. And in time, that was in the 50s, now it's 70 years later, in time, these homosexual priests acquired high offices. They became bishops over dioceses. They became cardinals, maybe even the popes. We don't know for sure, but maybe even a pope or two had homosexual tendencies. And they began to appoint other homosexual priests to high office. It's this self-fulfilling hierarchical attitude that we've seen for the last 1,500 years in the Roman Catholic Church. And when it's good, it's very good. And when it's bad, it's devastating. It's kind of like there's a restaurant in town that I used to frequent often. And one time I went there and there was a glaringly obvious homosexual waiter. He's fine. I don't care. He didn't ask me out on a date. So, none of my business. But I noticed him. The next time I went, there were 2 or 3. If you go there now, every person that works there is homosexual. What happens is the one homosexual, when a job vacancy came open, he contacted one of his friends and rushed down there. And because of civil rights laws, you can't refuse to employ someone because of their sexual orientation. And so they hired another one, then another, and now the entire staff is homosexual. And that's fine. I don't care. I still eat at the restaurant. But a similar thing happened in the Catholic Church in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And now the Catholic Church is being torn apart by their pedophile problems. They have Catholic priests that have sexually abused young boys, especially altar boys and the like that have a close association with the Catholic Church. They have been sexually abused, and there's no argument that it happened. The Catholic Church first tried to deny it back in the 90s, tried to deny there was a problem. After they saw that that wouldn't work, they said, well, it hasn't happened very much, and that was proven to be wrong. Then they challenged the people, you're talking about priests. You can't make these kind of accusations. When that didn't work, then they lawyered up. And now we have many dioceses, including the one in Phoenix, that's in bankruptcy, being sued by boys that were molested by the priests. And the Catholic priesthood wants to say that it's a celibacy problem, that their priests aren't allowed to marry and live normal, wholesome lives. And so they turn to these boys. Well, that's not true. That's not true. It's not a celibacy problem. It's a homosexual problem. There's nothing my wife could do or not do that would make me turn to a little boy. That's a homosexual problem. So they're going through the throes of problems today, very similar to what happened to them after the Black Death, when these unqualified, carnal, worldly men became religious leaders and began to promote other unqualified, worldly men to positions of leadership. And soon the Catholic Church was riven with these terrible problems that would cause the Protestant Reformation in 1517. The Catholic Church was at its zenith during the Dark Ages. They had problems of all kinds during the Dark Ages, but nothing like happened in the 1400s and the 1500s after the Black Death, after those men that had been appointed. And you also have to remember that back in the Renaissance, back in the 1400s and 1500s, the Catholic Church was very, very powerful. Popes rivaled kings in power and exceeded them in wealth. The Catholic Church was by far the wealthiest institution in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church had more money than the kings of France or England. They were exceedingly wealthy. One bishop in France had over 50,000 people that worked on his farms. He had huge holdings. He was very wealthy. And it was one of the traditions of the Catholic Church, I may have mentioned this back in the Dark Ages, that when you were dying, they would suggest that you make a bequeath to the church of a few acres just to cool the fires of hell or purgatory on you. And a lot of people, especially the wealthy, would indeed give a few acres. I mean, it didn't hurt them. They had tens of thousands of acres. They could afford to give the Catholic Church 100 acres to maybe help their soul through purgatory. Sound like a deal to them. And of course, the Catholic Church was like the black hole. If it went in, it never came out. And so you had family after family making these bequests to the church and over the period of centuries. So in time, the Catholic Church were the largest landowners in all the nations of medieval Europe. There was more Catholic land than there was royal land in France. At one time, the Catholic Church owned half the land in England and in Germany, and a lesser, believe it or not, in Italy, for whatever reason. And once it went in, it never came out. They would take it, but they would never sell it. And so they became more powerful as the decades and the centuries passed. They became richer and more powerful, and until the time of the Protestant Reformation, they were hugely wealthy. And this, of course, did not solve their problems. It made it worse. It was not unusual for bishops to ride on horses with the best of saddles, with shoes that were made of gold, horseshoes that were made of gold. It was not unusual for kings to come to churchmen asking for loans to help their governments, and they would go to the residences of bishops and cardinals that was like palaces. Because of the wealth and the power of the Catholic Church, a mindset evolved in the Catholic Church. And I want you to hear this. And this came indirectly from the Black Death. These men did not see themselves as deeply religious. They saw themselves as leaders. When the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church would elect a pope, they didn't try to find somebody that was deeply religious, deeply devoted to the gospel, that had the cause of Christ preeminent in their mind. No, they tried to find guys that had skills and abilities that would allow them to mix and mingle with the rich and the powerful in Europe, and were able to negotiate and had several languages and was urbane and educated, and so they tried to find men that could fit into the modern world. The thought of electing a pope because he was deeply religious and loved God was the last thing on their mind. And of course, when they got appointed, it was the last thing on people's mind. And so you see this self-perpetuating mental attitude that actually got worse as time passed until you got to a list of popes that were terrible people. They were terrible people. So a lot of things led to problems in the Catholic Church. Another thing that led, and we don't know about this much and hear about much, but there was a papal schism, a split in the Catholic Church. I'm looking at my notes here, so let me see. It was in 1378. One pope was elected, and some of the people didn't like who was elected, so they elected another pope. And so you had two popes, and then another guy got elected, so they had three popes at one time. And so the schism was real. Now, it was mended in 1417. But you have to remember, because the Catholic Church was so rich and so powerful, that it became an object of political maneuvering. Everybody wanted the Pope on their side. And Philip VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who was French, he maneuvered to have a French Pope elected. And this French Pope moved the papacy from its historical base in Rome, moved it to a little French town called Avignon, right across the river from Italy in France. And people, the Germans, the Italians, the British, a lot of people didn't like this because they were afraid they would tie the papacy too strongly to the French. And this was during the times of 100 Years' wars and battles and problems and rivalries and struggling for predominance and hegemony in Europe. And so they felt like that a pope under the influence of the French king or the British king or the German king was bad for the rest of the world. And so instead of an attempt to elect the best man possible, pressure and money was applied to try to get your particular man. It's not a lot different than a presidential election in the United States. We strive to get someone in office that reflects our views. Well, they wanted a pope that would see things the French way or the German way or the British way. And so when Clement V moved the papacy to Avignon, it shook up the Catholic Church. And a side effect was that all the people that heard about this and saw this realized that the Catholic Church could be moved by politics. It wasn't above the fray. The church here in Avondale that I pastor, I have gotten several invitations to have the mayor come and talk to the congregation, especially during election time. I'm not going to have it. I'm not going to politicize. I'm not going to go to their... I was invited to pray the benedictory prayer. I'm not going to go to their council meetings, and I'm not going to get involved in politics. I see the church is above the fray. Jesus said, if my servants were of this world, then they would fight. We'd get involved, but we're not of this world, and we shouldn't be involved in this world. And I know there are places in the South where preachers exercise great political power, and places like Louisiana. And I've heard that the governor knows the private telephone numbers, some preachers down there, and that may be true, and I don't care if it is. I don't see that as a positive. I see that as a potential negative. They're not your friends. They're after high office and power, and if they have to walk on you to get there, they'd be glad to. No problem. So we don't need to politicize the church. And while I'm at it, let me say to the whole body of Christ, if you think the answers for America's problems is in the political arena, then you need to get on your knees and pray. The problems in America are spiritual, not political, and they're not going to be solved by political maneuvering. If America doesn't call on God and get its spiritual act together, then it doesn't make any difference who's in the White House. America's going to have problems. We have spiritual problems, not political problems, and there are no political solutions to spiritual problems. Most of my friends vote Republican. Well, I love to tell them, don't think that getting a Republican in the White House or in the House of Representatives or in the Senate is going to solve America's problems. It's just going to be a knockdown, drag out from here on out. What America needs is revival. What we need is a spiritual revival. We need spiritual solutions to spiritual problems. And that's exactly what faced Europe in the 1400s and the 1500s. The church began a steep decline, and it started, in my opinion, I don't know of very many historians that would say this, but it started with the Black Death when all of those carnal men were appointed to priesthoods that under normal circumstances they would have never been into, and they voted in others like them and others like them, and the generations passed, and this carnal mindset became predominant, and then you started having popes that were just terrible people. So Avignon was the home of the papacy for a while, then it moved back to Rome, and the problems continued in the priesthood and in the church. And back during the times of the Black Death and afterward, the most reviled people in the community were the priests and the monks. They were the most hated. They caused the most suspicion. Everybody was suspicious of a priest, especially a monk. They thought they were the worst. You couldn't trust your wives or daughters with a monk. You couldn't trust your money with them. They were lying and cheating and stealing and seducing. They were vile men, and this came about, in my opinion, because of the Black Death that promoted a mindset of carnality and worldliness that the church should have no part in. To quote G.K. Chesterton, if the world grows worldly, the church can rebuke the world. But if the church grows worldly, nobody can rebuke the church. The world can't rebuke the church. If we don't do our job, the job won't be done. If we don't help the world be clean, then the world won't be clean, and neither will the church. So we went into a period where there was a steep decline in the attitudes of people toward the church. A rightful decline. They were terrible. Read books from antiquity like Robin Hood, the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. These are books that reflect the spirit of the age, and to be a monk was to make you the most suspicious person in the town. They reviled the church. They thought they were all liars and cheats and thieves, and I'm not real sure they weren't right. So anyway, the church had major problems. I was reading for this lesson today, and I came across a series of popes that came before the Protestant Reformation. So these popes from 1447 to 1503, I'm going to read you the list of the popes. I want you to notice something with me. Now, a lot of these reigns are very short because people didn't get elected until they were older, usually, and the life expectancy wasn't nearly as long, and so popes weren't in office very long. It's kind of like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their president is the oldest member of their council of 12 that runs the Mormon Church. Well, when one of the presidents die, there's no election, just the guy that's next in age becomes the new president. But a system like that of necessity means a lot of times you don't become president until you're 85. So it looks like in England, before the Queen of England abdicates the throne or dies, Charles is going to be 75 or 80. I know how old he is because he's exactly my age. So he could be easily 80 before he's crowned the king. So these were old popes, and the reason they didn't live very long is they became pope and they were older. These are not important, except they illustrate something I want to bring to you in a minute. So Nicholas V was from 1447 to 1455. Calixtus III was elected pope in 1455. He served to 1458, 3 years. Pius II was from 1458 to 1464, 8 years. Paul II was from 1464, 1471, 7 years. Sextus IV was pope from 1471 to 1484, 13 years, longer reign. Innocent VIII was from 1484 to 1492, 6 years. Alexander VI was pope and was elected pope 1492 and died of 1503, 9 years. Now, there's something about this list I want you to notice. First of all, notice how many names here are secular. You have a Paul, you have an Innocent, I guess you could call that a religious name. You have a couple of Pius, which means holy. But you have names here that have nothing to do with the church, nothing to do with righteousness. The Pope after Alexander VI was Leo, the lion. And these names are not biblical. Alexander named himself after Alexander the Great, who's about as secular and carnal a leader as imaginable. And this illustrates the secularization of the church. This shows you that these men that are supposed to be deeply religious, examples of moral excellence, these are supposed to be people that are the representative of Christ on earth, the vicars of Christ, chose names that had nothing to do with God, nothing to do with the gospel, nothing to do with righteousness. They were leaders. They were world leaders. They were military leaders. Alexander the Great was one of the great military leaders of all time. And this is Alexander the Sixth. That means there were 5 more. And I've been to the grave of Alexander the Eighth, so there was at least 2 more. They named themselves after a world religious leader that had nothing to do with God. This was a secularization of the church. And I've stopped at Alexander because we want to stop and talk about Alexander the Sixth for a while. Several years ago, I was in Rome, and I was with friends, and we were going on a tour of St. Peter's Basilica, the big church there in the Vatican City. And we saw a sign that said, English-speaking guides meet at this place at a certain time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon or something, whatever, 1 o'clock, whenever it was. So we met at that place, and the guide was a Catholic priest. He spoke very good English, and he took us on a personal tour. There's about 6 or 8 of us. he took us on a personal tour of St. Peter's. And if you've ever been there, you know that there's the high altar in the front, and of course it was made by Bernini, an Italian. It's all very ornate. I think that's called Rocco style, and it's very flamboyant, very exaggerated. And he did the decoration for the high altar, and that, of course, is directly over the tomb of St. Peter's tomb, and that's why they chose that location. And he led us around through the avenues of the building. It's a huge building, of course, the biggest church in Christendom. And poor old Apostolic Pentecost. We think we've got so much. The most beautiful, biggest, richest church in Pentecost wouldn't buy the floor for St. Peter's Basilica. Anyway, we're not going to be great because of what we got. We're going to be great because of the gospel that we preach. If that doesn't elevate us, nothing's going to do it. We can't compete with even the Baptists, much less the Catholics. In our riches and our buildings and our affluence, we have no chance. It's not about us. It's about the gospel. So anyway, I went along with everybody, and we were looking at all the ornateness and the beauty and the gilded roof and 200 feet above us and the four big posts that hold up the dome, Michelangelo, catch it, Michelangelo's dome that was designed by Michelangelo. And in these four pillars are four sacred relics of the Catholic Church. They have the spear of Longinus, the Roman guard that pierced the Jesus side, supposedly. They have Veronica's scarf that when she wiped the face of Jesus, his image came off on the scarf, supposedly. Then they had the bones of St. Mark in there. I think they've been removed, or St. Luke, one of them. And then they have in the fourth one a piece of the true cross. Now, if all the wood was accumulated that would, this supposedly a piece of the true cross I've read that would build a wooden warship. So whether this is true or not, I'll leave it up to your gullibility or your faith, whichever. Anyway, very interesting tour, very interesting. And we finally went through the section of the building that had the Pope's graves in it, mausoleums. And downstairs is where most of them are at, 90%, but upstairs they have several beautiful, ornate. Some of these are designed by the greatest artists that ever lived. And we went to, I can't remember all of them now. I can't even remember hardly any of them until we came to Alexander's grave. And this was a man that was a terrible example of godliness. His real name was Rodrigo Borgia. He was from Spain. He was the relative of another pope. That's one of the ways he got in. But he openly bribed his way into being the pope. He spent millions of dollars to become the pope. He knew he'd get paid back. And he finally won the election, became Alexander VI. And while he was in office, he named several of his relatives to high office, like cardinals. He named one of his sons cardinal. That's right, son. He had several children. Most church leaders winked upon these youthful indiscretions, they called it. Boys will be boys. And so he had several children. Caesar Borgia, he was the example for The Prince, written by Machiavelli. And then he had a daughter of exceeding beauty named Lucretia Borgia, of considerable fame. And Alexander must have thought she was beautiful too, because he had a child by her. That's right, his own daughter in the Vatican. So this is about as bad example of Christianity as can be imagined. He was a terrible man, terrible father, terrible Christian. He wasn't a Christian at all. And yet he was the Pope. He was the one that people would bow down and kiss his finger, his ring on his hand, kiss his foot if necessary. And so this was a real bad guy. And almost by universal acclaim, the worst pope morally that's ever lived. When we got to his grave, I was interested to see what the priest would say about Alexander's tomb. And he said, this is the tomb of Alexander VI. And he started to move on. I said, wait, can I ask a question? He said, sure. I said, you know me. I said, what about Alexander? How does the church handle the problems that Alexander brought to the priesthood, to the papacy? And he said, what priests? What problems? I said, what problems? Lucretia, the murders, the robberies, the bribing to get in. He said, what problems? I said, oh, that's how you handle it. He said, that's how we handle it, and we just moved on. So he was an example of what brought, 15 years later after his death, brought the Catholic Church to his knees in 1517 with Martin Luther. The world saw this. Everybody saw it. The church was held in such disdain that nobody saw it as religious. Nobody. They went through the motions of prayer. They went through the motions of living for God. The entire Christian world was rotten to the core, or Luther would have never had a chance to do what he did. It was rotten to its core. And 15 years later, it burst open with the Protestant Reformation. Now, I've left a lot of things, world-shaking events out of this story. I didn't talk about 1492, the discovery of the New World, Nuevo Mundo. I haven't, the things that were exceedingly important, because this, first of all, is history about the church, but there's not enough time. I'd have to make 500 of these lessons to skim the surface of what was going on. But I've got us now to 1517, to Martin Luther. The next lesson will be about the great reformer, Martin Luther.
Okay.